Alrighty, well, we are just after noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more individuals will come in, but thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. This is the next webinar in the resiliency series hosted by the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration. I'm going to let Hannah, the Director of Transportation and at the City of Greensboro, and also the North Carolina chapter president, handle introductions, but I just wanted to pop up this slide that has some of the CM information. I will also be putting that in the chat with the link to the CM details. We really do encourage questions. Please submit your questions through the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box. That will just help us keep track of all inquiries. You can also use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted during the formal Q&A if you'd prefer to ask your question out loud. And if you have any logistical questions, feel free to pop those in the chat or direct message me. And I realized I just wanted to go back this QR code here. If you go ahead and scan that on your phone, you should be able to pull up the Mentimeter for this presentation, which Hannah will talk more about in just a moment. And we'll also put the link to that in the chat as well. This webinar is being recorded. I'm sure you were notified on your screens. The recording will be posted to our the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration YouTube in the coming days, where you can also find all of our other previously recorded webinars in the series. But I will hand it over to Hannah. Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Jillian. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sharing your lunch hour with us. I'm Hannah Cockburn, and I not only serve as the Director of Transportation in Greensboro, North Carolina, but I'm also the outgoing president of the North Carolina chapter of APA, and I'm really grateful for the partnership with the Mid-Atlantic Planning Collaboration team members to allow us to bring this series to a wider audience of individuals and people who care about helping communities resolve their resiliency and sustainability issues. I'm going to start us off with a few questions just to get us going. Let's see. I want to make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. There we go. All right. As Jillian mentioned, please scan the QR code or use the code that's at the top of the screen to participate in the Menti survey questions. We've just got a few questions to help get us started and for our speakers to have a good understanding of where people are from. The link to the Menti is also in the chat if you want to use that instead. But let's go ahead and ask our first question. So where are you joining us from today? The locations are the different chapter areas in the Mid-Atlantic collaboration. But we also have other because we had several folks reach out to participate today that are outside of this region. We'll give you just a second to answer. Looks like we have a great showing from North Carolina today. And another really strong showing from Virginia as well. Give it just another minute or so. We've got a few people's responses still coming in. Fantastic. Thanks everyone for participating in this first question. Let's start with the next question. What is your role in resilience? So this can be, I'm a planner, I'm a local official, I do this as my day job, whatever your one or two word response will be, and it'll build a word bubble for us. So no surprise that planner is the top answer here, but we've also got some other interesting responses as well. Geospatial, doing community engagement, working as a floodplain administrator, redevelopment. What else have we got here? They move around so fast. Economic development, watershed, GIS, and of course, consultants. We'll give it just another minute or so to let everyone type in their responses. All right, thank you for submitting your answers to this. It looks like we have a really good cross-section of people who have a wide range of roles related to this topic. And here's our final question for you. What is it that you were hoping to learn today? If you have specific topics or questions that you were hoping to hear about, this is your chance to document those, and we'll do our best to have those questions, if they're questions or topics, addressed, and questions in the Q&A at the end of the session. So it looks like we're getting a good number of responses here. A lot of different things, all the way from general information to working with folks, incorporation of sustainability topics into long range and neighborhood plans, innovative opportunities, best practices, how this works for small towns. And we'll let you vote on these here. Got vulnerability, tips and tricks, protect funds. That's an important topic about how to fund some of these projects. Learning from your peers. These are all great topics to make sure that we are covering today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and introduce our speakers, and then I will turn it over to Matt to get us kicked off. Our speakers, we're really fortunate to be joined by two really well-respected speakers. Our first today is Matt Hutchins, who is the CEO at Fernleaf and has 12 years of experience supporting communities and groups in planning for and making informed decisions on climate resilience and adaptation strategies. Matt has experience in conducting vulnerability and risk assessments and provides climate resilience decision support services and tools to dozens of communities across the U.S. Matt, thanks for being with us today. Our second speaker today is Sean LaHave, who serves as HAF's Resilience Market Leader, where he advances climate resilience services through a focus on multidisciplinary collaboration and innovation. He specializes in local and regional approaches to flood risk management and has advised agencies at the local, regional, and national level. Sean, thanks for participating today too. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Hannah. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, my name is Matt Hutchins. I'm with Fernleaf, and thank you all for the opportunity to present to you today. Fernleaf, we're a small business located in North Carolina, And we've been working, as Hannah mentioned, with communities across the Eastern US in resilience planning and working with communities at different steps in that planning process. And so today I hope to be able to share with you provide an overview of general resilience planning steps that we found helpful in working with communities who are at different beginning steps in the planning process and considering resilience planning. I also hope to share some examples of implementation each step and provide resources. And I think that's a really key part that I plan on providing through this slideshow are resources that you all can hopefully incorporate into your planning initiatives. So with that, I will go forward and share a little bit about how we envision what climate resilience means and what it is. Here's two graphs that present the idea of functional capacity, and that when an acute hazard or threat event occurs in a community, that it impacts a community's functional capacity and it drops off a usual baseline. So the idea that we talk about with communities is that becoming more resilient involves making investments before these hazard events occur to increase that functional capacity and to keep that functional capacity from dropping off a baseline when hazard events occur. And so that's the kind of concept and conceptual model that we have in working with communities. A big part of our work in working with communities, and that I will review with you all today, is the STEPS Resilience Planning process. This comes from NOAA's STEPS Resilience from the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, led by NOAA, but really is an interagency team and groups working on developing steps that planners and communities can use. It's been applied in state, regional, county, and local municipal planning. It really involves two parts: a risk assessment phase and then a management framework. And I think key here is that it's supported by resources and decision support tools that I'll be giving an overview of. The steps here are iterative, and that's why we kind of present them here in a circle, starting from understanding hazards and exposure to assessing vulnerability and risk, looking at options for building resilience and prioritizing them before taking action. But really key here is that it is centered around an equity-centered approach to resilience. And what equity and resilience really starts with is engagement. And so this resource and all of these that you'll see are going to be available through toolkit.climate.gov. And so it's definitely a resource that I'll point you all to here a few times for certain resources and steps where you can find more detail. As I mentioned, with community engagement and thinking about equitable resilience, this is a framework developed by Rosa Gonzalez with Facilitating Power, and it's one that the STEPS Resilience kind of revolves around the idea of meaningful engagement to incorporate community voices and perspectives. Really considers the spectrum from less meaningful on the left-hand side to more meaningful types of engagement on the right-hand side. And so our approach in what we work with communities is understanding where a starting place is, realizing that collaborative governance is maybe not something that all communities are at a starting place for with all community members, but thinking about moving from involving the third step and higher in the engagement process and at each step in the resilience planning process. So as we move into the first step here of understanding exposure, I'll provide a little bit more information about how communities work through that this first step. The understanding of communities really starts with understanding of people and community assets. And here are a few examples of common types of community assets that we work with and that communities have found helpful in addressing and considering in the resilience planning framework. From residential assets and residents, but thinking about commercial and industrial properties, community services, critical infrastructure, but also essential services, and roads and mobility. And combining that with the perspective of what hazards are impacting communities. Here are common types of hazards that through the Mid-Atlantic region, we've worked with communities in addressing the current flooding, but also future flooding, considering sea level rise in coastal communities, extreme heat, and also wildfire. And there are other hazards here. There's been a total of 14 different types of hazards that have been considered through the STEPS resilience framework, but here are some common ones. The Climate Explorer is a resource in the STEPS resilience framework that can help communities understand current hazards and potential for them to change into the future. So the Climate Explorer provides climate maps, graphs of temperature and precipitation, and observe historical thresholds and how often those have been exceeded in a community. And so if you go to the Climate Explorer, you can type in your community name, and any county in the US will come up and give you graphics and information about current climate conditions and future projections. The next step here is an assessment of vulnerability and risk. So we'll start by looking at what do we mean by vulnerability and risk. And here's an image that helps to convey a lot of things in one picture about what's meant by vulnerability. And so when we think about these three homes, they may equally be exposed or in a floodplain, let's say, as the hazard, exposed to flooding in this case. But based on the property level characteristics, they have different levels of adaptive capacity, making them more or less vulnerable if a flood event were to occur. And so here, the house in the middle has less building elevation than the homes on either side of it, making it more vulnerable than the ones on either side of it. So these are the types of characteristics that we start thinking about. And I saw in one of the beginning responses, thinking about building and property level vulnerability, and that's the scale at which the asset level scale that the STEPS Resilience recommends community addressing. So after understanding these characteristics of vulnerability, how susceptible and adaptive infrastructure and people and places are, looks at a multi-scale assessment. And so providing that information at the property or parcel level is shown on the right-hand side. This is an example from a community. It's actually a regional scale in the Land of Sky Regional Council in Western North Carolina. And so the map on the left-hand side shows a 5-county area of an assessment that the Land of Sky Regional Council produced. But again, that analysis is performed at the asset scale, looking at different characteristics of flood likelihood, building height, and different essential and critical services for commercial and different types of critical infrastructure as well. The other key element is considering different types of social vulnerabilities. Here's an example of another community in North Carolina. This is the city of New Bern, North Carolina, so a smaller coastal community that identified homes vulnerable to flooding. That's what the map is showing there on the right-hand side. Those are looking at census tract areas and neighborhoods. And the city also identified that 3 of these neighborhood areas have not only high physical vulnerability, but also have among the highest levels of households experiencing poverty in those neighborhoods. And so being able to look at these multiple dimensions of physical and social vulnerability is really key. And here's another example. This is a community in Florida, and this is looking at an extreme heat analysis. And so what this analysis provided was information that about a quarter of schools are located in high heat vulnerable areas. And so idea of the assessment phase of the planning process, providing actionable insights that then get carried forward into the next steps of the planning process. Another key topic is considering transportation and equitable access. So for multiple communities throughout the Eastern US have been looking at different types of transportation vulnerabilities. This is an example with Charleston area, where different points of critical access are being disrupted by different levels and types of flooding, tidal flooding versus storm surge flooding. So being able to look at different types of risks and vulnerabilities, but also thinking about not only the emergency access aspect of this as a risk, but also the equitable access to core services And so that's something that communities throughout the Eastern US are looking at in terms of how are interruptions to access to core services being affected, and especially in low income and underserved communities. So as we move through the steps, we'll then get into investigate options. And so bringing forward all of the information and insights in the assessment of vulnerability and risk and the different components and insights that provides into considering, okay, what are options that can be used to address these vulnerabilities? So to do that, we found it helpful in working with communities through a whole of government approach, not just thinking about infrastructure, but different types of natural and gray infrastructure, but also different elements of funding and finance, of community engagement and capacity building, of governance capacity building, of policies and ordinances, and land use planning. And so it also pulls in actions that are within existing plans. And it's a really key part that we found in working with communities of all types is referencing comprehensive plans, looking at capital improvement planning, to incorporate that and look at opportunities within those to be building resilience. So thinking about all programs and operations, but also looking at new multi-benefit solutions. And so a lot of the assessment of vulnerabilities in communities identify new issues or issues that have not been fully addressed. And so thinking about new types of solutions and thinking about not only current, but also future changes. And so that's something I didn't cover too much in the previous assessment, but as we look at both current and future conditions, those can be looked at individually to identify those as future risks. Another resource here I'll point to in the toolkit is what's called an options database. And these are example strategies and actions that communities have taken throughout the US. There's more than 1,000 example options from communities. So you can find comparable communities to yourselves, and you can sort and filter these by types of hazards and by types of community assets that they were used to address. You'll see the action type, whether it's capacity building or planning, and so on. So again, this is one of the resources that I want folks to know is available, that you can go in and sort this. We found it as a helpful starting place, realizing there's tailoring that a community can make and using these as a starting place, but also understanding kind of peer communities of what approaches have been used that have been effective. The information from the assessment phase can also be used in this options development to review policies and ordinances. And here's kind of bringing that assessment to use in this step. This map is a small community in Western North Carolina. And one element of the vulnerability assessment was looking at ordinances. And in dark green here are properties in the floodplain that were constructed before the first base flood elevation requirements were in place. And so this identified a key corridor and key area for this small city where these are buildings that are not elevated, that are going to take a certain type of elevation strategy or certain types of protection to prevent them from flooding in the future. And so again, thinking about how different components of vulnerability can be used in thinking about policies and ordinances, but also types of strategies to address the vulnerabilities. The next step is taking those options and prioritizing them and putting them into a plan. In terms of approach for prioritization, communities have found it helpful to look at really two components of prioritization. One is thinking about how is a certain strategy or action reducing vulnerability and risk? And the second is thinking about what is the ability to implement that and identifying then strategies to alleviate barriers towards implementation. This is showing just a few example options for a community in looking at a red light, green light approach to does it meet these criteria? And again, we found it helpful for thinking about how you can use the assessment to identify, okay, how is this action going to be reducing vulnerability? but also thinking about what is the feasibility, and if it's not feasible, what are some actions that can be taken to make it more feasible. A lot of those we find is around the area of staff capacity as a barrier towards implementation. And here's an example of that. This is another community in North Carolina that looking at potential project locations and using that assessment then to understand the potential benefits that a project could have. Again, thinking about that asset scale and asset level. What this also did was provide the opportunity to look at multi-hazard benefits. In this case, on the left-hand side is showing the flood risk, and on the right-hand side is showing landslide risk. And with that, this project area that could be addressing both of these hazards, you can see the number of residential properties, 195 properties, 42 of those are of highest vulnerability and representing an almost $70 million improvement value associated with those properties. And so again, thinking about with this project, where to be prioritized, what are the benefits that it could be providing in terms of reduction of vulnerability in the community? The last step is then taking action. In terms of taking action, we recognize that implementation of strategies and actions take, in some cases, many years to go from development to implementation. There's also really two options in terms of how a resilience plan can come to fruition, either as a standalone resilience plan or being integrated with other planning initiatives. And here are three examples on the right-hand side that really took different approaches to this. One is the all hazards assessment that the city of Charleston did a few years ago, where it was a standalone assessment, but it was then that assessment was integrated into multiple planning initiatives, from the comprehensive plan to the emergency operations plan to a land use and water plan. Another example is the city of New Bern, North Carolina, that produced a standalone resiliency and hazard mitigation plan. And then another example in North Carolina is Buncombe County, in the Asheville area. Buncombe County developed a comprehensive plan that included a resilience element and leveraged assessment information in its comprehensive plan. So again, just different ways of incorporating and including resilience in the planning process. Another key element towards implementation is building stakeholder support. The buy-in from not only the community, but also elected leaders is key. And being able to work across scales of decision makers. We find this especially for transportation that is sometimes a regional needing for regional partners for thinking about transportation vulnerabilities and solutions. And then communication, which is key both for internal and external audiences. Internal with developing shared understanding of the risks and priorities within local governments, but also externally with, again, elected leaders, but with community members or other partners. And here's an example of, again, a city of Charleston communicating project benefits. Here's a kind of before and after story where, based on using their assessment information, they're able to articulate the benefits that one tidal valve installation was providing. It was reducing 50% of their vulnerability for churches on the peninsula, 20% of their public housing, and 10% of their critical facilities vulnerabilities through one installation here. And so again, this was in working with understanding what is the project benefit area and then using the assessment to help communicate that. So that went through the step to resilience process. Another initiative now that I wanted you all to make you all aware of is something called the Climate Smart Communities Initiative. So it's you can go to it and find more information at climatesmartcommunity.org. It's in the first year of a multi-year program, and it's focused on capacity building and using the steps resilience planning framework. Both practitioners and communities can apply. Communities can apply to be matched with practitioners for leading through the steps resilience planning framework. And just recently, earlier this month, was the first announcement of award of 11 communities in the first year. But it is a multi-year program and something that I wanted everyone to be aware of. And Fernleaf is also supporting partner of the program, but it is a collaborative program between a public-private partnership with NOAA. So definitely wanted to make folks aware of that. So I realized that was kind of a lot and a blast through a lot of information. Happy to be following up if anyone has any questions. But thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who's going to share more about lessons learned.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Matt. And give me 1 second to share my screen. Pulling it up right now. And can you see that?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And yeah, just want to give a shout out to Matt. That was a fantastic presentation and really highlighted some of the most essential concepts in resilience planning that we have to understand not only in Florida, but all across the country. And that really brings into perspective why resilience is such an important discussion point right now. It's happening all over the United States and even all over the globe to a certain extent. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned, best practices to be shared. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. My name is Sean, Resilience Market Leader for HAF. We're a full service infrastructure consulting firm, specialized in the full life cycle of infrastructure projects, all the way from planning to implementation. This presentation is really going to be focused on vulnerability assessments and planning, but really do want to emphasize that our ultimate objective is to actually fix these problems. And then what I'm really excited about as well, been primarily based in Florida with these projects over the past few years. But I've spent a lot of time in North Carolina and Virginia on a personal level, go winter camping and spend a lot of time in Asheville, for example. So it's a really cool opportunity just to see other people's perspectives, answer questions, and see maybe what we're doing differently in Florida compared to other states and what you all are doing. So really, really excited about this opportunity. So for today's presentation, I'm going to highlight some lessons from the Resilient Florida program. This was established in 2021, and there's a lot of interesting insights to be drawn from the projects that we've worked on already and that we're completing or currently proposing. So to give a little bit of background, I'm going to start off personally. I grew up in South Florida in Palm Beach County, lived through many hurricane events, had personal losses within my family when it came to hurricanes, flooding. So definitely saw the impacts firsthand. And going back to the 1990s, Hurricane Andrew was something that really came to people's minds. But we're seeing so many devastating Category 4 or Category 5 hurricane events year after year in Florida and other places like Texas and Louisiana. And it's really becoming more of the norm. And so it's just a question of what does that mean, especially for planning, and what does it mean for infrastructure? So what I really want to emphasize in terms of background is that natural disasters, if we're looking at hurricanes, for example, from my perspective, they're becoming more economically destructive. We go back 100 years, even in Florida, there were hurricanes taking place, but there were less assets, there was less infrastructure, there was less people in harm's way. And what we have today is that Florida is one of the fastest growing states in the country. Texas is as well. And you have other economic development trends. And that really shows you that we just have more at risk today because we've built a lot of infrastructure and a lot of people are living in these low-lying locations. So going back to what I just said about recent hurricane impacts. So 2017 Hurricane Irma, swept up all across Florida. It was massive. Hurricane Michael, I'll show you an image of in a second, 2018, hit the Florida Panhandle sort of by surprise, devastating impacts. Hurricane Ian, 2022, Idalia, 2023, and then most recently, Hurricane Debbie in 2024. So the point here is that all of these were major hurricane events, took place over recent years, and they had pretty significant impacts on Florida. And this has made climate resilience a top level priority for the state of Florida, all the way at the governor's office level and the legislature. And it's really changing how the state is understanding its vulnerabilities. So I mentioned the Resilient Florida program, the primary focus of this presentation. So skipping a bullet point for a second, but the Resilient Florida program, it's been managed and administered by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. This was a collaborative effort through the state legislature, governor's office, a lot of different entities to create a program that would fund planning projects to evaluate vulnerabilities, but most importantly, support the actual development of infrastructure projects, including construction. So this program was established in 2021. There is a section of the Florida statute, section 380.093. We're going to talk about that as well. And as part of the statutory requirements passed in 2021, every municipality, every county in the state of Florida is required by law to conduct a flood vulnerability assessment, really focused on public infrastructure assets. And there's different types of VAs. There's rainfall-induced inland vulnerability assessments, and then there's coastal ones more looking at sea level rise and storm surge. But every government in the state, so more than 60 counties, more than 400 municipalities, and it's been a very insane process just to see how much work has been done in such a short period of time. So that was a requirement. A lot of communities at this point in Florida have met the requirements or are nearing the completion. And then if we're looking at the implementation dollars, which is really the most important part of all of this, since 2021, we're only in 2024, there's been a $1.4 billion investment by the state of Florida in infrastructure projects to support flood adaptation. So there's a lot going on, but there's also limitations to how the state of Florida is approaching it. We'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Two other components outside of FDEP and the state level perspective. At the local level, that was one of the interests in this presentation. Municipalities, counties, and even at the state have appointed chief resilience officer positions. So CROs are becoming increasingly more common or mainstream across public policy circles in the United States. The state of Florida, similar to the state of North Carolina, has a chief resilience officer at the state level. But then all of these towns and cities also have CROs. And then I would say what sort of makes Florida unique, very unique, has been these regional resilience collaboratives, sort of similar to what you all are doing with the Mid-Atlantic collaboration. But if you're familiar with councils of government in the United States and in the state of Florida, we have 10 regional planning councils. Before working with HAF, I was with the Northeast Florida Regional Council. And these regional councils are sort of quasi-governmental agencies, and they form regional resilience collaboratives to sort of bring elected officials and leaders together across jurisdictions to think about this regionally. And I really think that's important. And a big part of what we've done through the Resilient Florida program has been focused on regional assessments. Did a regional vulnerability assessment for 9 counties surrounding the city of Tallahassee in the Appalachia region. And then we also did a project for 7 counties in the Tampa. And I think that's where a lot of scalable solutions are possible. So that was a lot of background, but really important points of just kind of what's going on in Florida and why this is a very important state to be looking at right now in terms of resilience planning. I mentioned Hurricane Michael back in 2018. I just want to show you the sheer size of this Category 5. I live in Jacksonville in Northeast Florida, and like Jacksonville, a lot of people in the Panhandle for many decades just thought that, they were lucky. It's not going to happen. Hurricanes happen in Southeast Florida or different parts. So this was a wake-up call for the community. Category 5 direct hit. In closing this presentation, I'll show you the impacts to Mexico Beach, right where the eye is in this storm. And then more recently in 2022, if you all remember, Hurricane Ian, this really had a devastating impact across Southwest Florida and Fort Myers, Sanibel Island, and those areas. And you can see the impacts here in Fort Myers Beach. Homes are completely destroyed. There was major impacts from storm surge. And I think some of these places during these recent hurricanes up to 18 feet of depth in storm surge. So you had fire trucks underwater, crazy impacts. So this is sort of going back to, what Matt was talking about with how do we think about resilience? And from a basic lens, it comes down to shocks versus stresses. So shocks are sudden events. They happen immediately, cause an immediate loss of function. I think the best example of a shock is a hurricane. But the decent part about hurricane planning is you can see it coming, unlike a tornado. So there are preparedness actions that can be taken, but we still haven't figured it out or solved the problem. And then on the contrary to shocks, there's also stresses. Stresses are different in that they're long-term. They weaken the fabric of a community. I took this picture a few years ago in downtown Jacksonville, where I live, and there's a tributary where water, overflows during the high tide. There's no storm. It's a blue sky day. This is becoming increasingly more prevalent all across the eastern seaboard. South Beach in Miami is having major issues. If we go to Savannah, Charleston, Norfolk. So sunny day flooding is a stress compared to a shock, in that it's happening over time, it's getting worse over time, and it disrupts community functions. And I don't have to, take this home too hard because Matt really covered this well. But just emphasizing again that you can have two neighboring homes, two neighboring facilities, and it's just all dependent on how they're built, how they're designed. So with this hypothetical example, we have two homes. Let's just say they're right next to each other. And so they technically have the same exposure if they're on the ocean or on a tributary. They're both geographically exposed to that hazard, but they have a different level of sensitivity, in that how they will respond to the hazard, like flooding, will be different. And that's a key part of the vulnerability assessment. So with the context and background established, want to spend a few minutes talking about vulnerability assessments and what they have looked like in Florida. There's a lot of valuable lessons from how Florida has approached this. I think it's been a very effective approach, but there's some other things that maybe we can evolve into in the coming years. But I really do strongly believe that other states across the country need to start considering similar top-down planning initiatives where it's essentially required by law. So with the Resilient Florida program, we talked enough about that. But with the vulnerability assessments, want to emphasize, so every community was not necessarily just given the money. They had to actually go out and apply for it, but it was a requirement. So on an annual basis, there has been $20 million in planning grants to support the development of infrastructure vulnerability assessments. And the vulnerability assessments are a requirement or a prerequisite for local governments to qualify for the implementation funds. There's been a minimum commitment of $100 million a year for the implementation projects. Again, $1.4 billion. But if you do not conduct a vulnerability assessment, you're not going to get the implementation funds. And that's really been the incentive for local governments. This is the most important part. This is essentially how Florida has structured our state's approach to evaluating infrastructure vulnerabilities. So everything can be found in section 380.093 Florida statutes. So the first component is, what type of infrastructure or critical assets are we evaluating the vulnerabilities of? So there's 4 critical asset classes, or if you want to call them categories, they're referred to as classes. These are all defined in the statute. And so the 4 main classes are transportation assets and evacuation routes. Pretty straightforward to understand. Critical infrastructure, water treatment plants, lift stations, pump stations, and so forth. Critical community and emergency facilities, looking at fire stations, police stations, local government facilities, etc. And then natural, cultural, and historical resources, including conservation lands, shorelines, and public parks. So the whole purpose of the vulnerability assessment is to inventory all of these assets, prepare flood or hazard layers, and then determine which assets are vulnerable. Just want to emphasize again, the focus in the state of Florida has been on publicly owned or maintained critical assets. There are some private facilities like hospitals that come into play here, but the assessments, according to the state requirements, have not looked at residential, have not looked at commercial. So we believe there's still room for improvement, or there's still opportunity to expand how we're thinking about this. But this has been a very, very strong starting point, especially for promoting the conversation across the state and within the context of what government can actually handle and take care of. And then in Florida, we're surrounded by water. So it's the program has been exclusively focused on water-related threats. So for those coastal communities, looking at current and future tidal flooding, and then that's really the nuisance flooding and the changes with tides. Current and future storm surge flooding. So again, looking at some of these major hurricane events or major storm events. But again, these are for coastal jurisdictions. And when we're referring to the future tidal and or storm surge, that's adding sea level rise projections to it. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the two other components are rainfall-induced flooding and compound flooding. Rainfall-induced flooding is prevalent everywhere, really all across the United States. But for inland communities, the tidal flooding storm surge components would not even be applicable. So some of these assessments are only focused on rainfall. And then compound flooding, little more complicated to understand and model from an engineering perspective. But it's looking at, when different variables intersect or overlap at the same time, what does that result in? And a good example, if you have a hurricane and it hits a particular area, if it's high tide or low tide, it's going to have a different influence on the outcomes of that event. Compound is still sort of in its infancy if we're talking about how we understand it across government and industry and the scientific and research community and universities. But there's a lot of work definitely going to take place over the next 10 years. And then just from a very basic perspective, just want to outline, so with these planning projects funded by the Resilient Florida program, the two main outcomes have been the VAs and adaptation plans. Sometimes it's been funded through the same grant. So with the vulnerability assessment, we've taken all of this GIS data. So we work with the local community to inventory all of those critical assets. We get topographic conditions, and then we develop the flood scenario rasters. All of the sea level rise projections are based on national projections made available through NOAA. So that's been absolutely essential. The exposure analysis of the vulnerability assessment is really focused on the geographical intersection of critical assets and different flood layers. Sensitivity takes it to the next level, where we start understanding what is the flood depth associated with each scenario at each location. So there's going to be a big difference if it's a few inches or a few feet. And that's what we're trying to understand there. That has helped us rank or prioritize projects based on the vulnerability assessment. So we've been able to look at flood hazard vulnerability, consequence analysis, economic loss, and then there's some social vulnerability considerations as well. And then with the adaptation plan, this is the second phase after the vulnerability assessment. And this is really focused on taking outcomes from the VA and identifying what strategies can be leveraged or deployed to actually address the issues being looked at. And there's also focus area analysis to ground the recommendations in local neighborhoods. So a lot of what we've done has been from a 30,000 foot perspective, but we also want to understand what are the local implications and how are neighborhoods different from one another. And this is a slightly different take. That was more of the technical, explanation. But in terms of like a chronological order of how this operates, and I heard comprehensive planning and land development regs come up, so want to really highlight that here as well. So with this entire project, this is just a continuation of resilience planning from identifying vulnerabilities to actually identifying strategies, ultimately leading into implementation. So with every one of these projects, we start off with a kickoff meeting and SWOT analysis workshop. The photo on the right, this is with the city of Panama City. And the SWOT analysis workshop has been extremely fun and informative in that we invite every department or division director from a local government, including the city manager, fire chief, police chief, GIS staff. We bring everyone into the same room and we talk about what are you doing well, what are you not doing well, what needs to change. And that really informs the priorities for the project, especially in terms of what they want to focus on for implementation. Go through the data collection process, conduct all the analyses. We've spoken about that already. FDP has required 2 public outreach meetings as part of these projects. It's all dependent on the level of effort that you put in. We were very fortunate with Panama City. We had really good participation. We had elected officials, the mayor participate, members of the public. And during the public outreach meetings, there was a lot of insights from the public that, they never heard of these types of things before, and they were, thinking of new possibilities for their community with living shorelines or nature-based solutions. So that was a really inspiring part of the process. And for those of you who are focused on comp plans or public policy, before the Resilient Florida program was established, all coastal jurisdictions in the state of Florida on the Atlantic Ocean or Gulf of Mexico were required to pass a comp plan amendment referred to as peril of flood. And this was the state of Florida's one of their early attempts to require local governments to consider sea level rise or future sea level rise conditions as part of planning. So that's really where the land use and zoning components come into play. And with the adaptation plan, a big part of our objective has been to not only look at physical solutions, but policy solutions as well, to really figure out how to build resilience. It's not just going to be one project here, one project there. You have to completely rethink how you're regulating land use, how you're interacting with FEMA through the community rating system. There's all of these public policy components, and that's why planners play an essential role in all of this. And it doesn't matter what community you're in. If you have flood vulnerabilities, whether it's riverine flooding, coastal, etc., all of these components are really important. And then finally, implementation channels. A big part of this is looking at grant funding opportunities. Can local governments pay for some of this on their own? So those are all of the things we're trying to really focus on to promote the planning to design continuum. So a few more slides just to provide you with some more detailed information. So looking at the data sources, because we know planners always like to find the best data available. So with the critical and regionally significant asset data, for the most part, this has been the case in Florida. Almost every government already has this maintained. So it just depends on what client we're working with or what jurisdiction. Some of the smaller jurisdictions who don't have GIS capabilities or staff didn't have anything available. And that's when we just looked at state or federal sources. I think the state of Florida at this point, all of these roadways, fire stations, et cetera, it's really mapped out pretty comprehensively. But that might not be the case all across the United States. And those are where maybe there's some opportunities, for federal agencies, the White House to think about what support do local communities, especially rural communities, need to bolster these data abilities. With topographic data, when we're preparing flood rasters, everything is based on digital elevation model. So in Florida, for the most part, the most recent is the 2018 Florida Peninsular Project. But in Panama City, there was a more recent one that was flown after Hurricane Michael. With the storm surge and tidal flooding or mean higher high water, relying on existing data from FEMA flood insurance studies. I mentioned the sea level rise projections. This is reflecting the most recent requirements that were passed, July 1st. But there's been some changes in the statutory requirements. When the program first came out, we were looking at the 2017 NOAA sea level rise projection. So that was a report published in 2017. And we were looking at 2040 and 2070. That's recently changed. So we're looking at the most updated report and now 2050 and 2080. But that has to be interpolated with the two closest tide gauges to a local study area. So there's NOAA tide gauges all across the United States. I'm going to show one of them in a moment. And then with a few of the other things, again, the future rainfall is a little bit more nuanced. It's not fully understood like some of those other variables, but NASA has produced change factors for rainfall. And then I would also add, this is really what Matt highlighted too, is that there's so many different data considerations that can be applied to this planning process. And that's why it's important to engage local officials to understand what they're looking for. Center for Disease Control has the social vulnerability index data, shows you which populations and census blocks are most socially vulnerable from an economic perspective. And then it's been becoming increasingly important to identify finished floor elevation data. So where's the first floor of a building? What types of flood scenarios actually impact the ability of that asset to function? This is an example of tide gauge data that we're very fortunate to have in the United States. So NOAA started installing these in the early 1900s. Mayport, Florida, Mayport Naval Air Station, just north of Jacksonville. Since 1930, we've seen about 9 inches approximately of sea level rise. And we can see trend lines. So we have a historical baseline. Not every area goes this far back. That's why they really want you to take the two closest tide gauges. But there are some different ways of approaching that. So this is the historical perspective. This is an empirical basis for saying sea level rise is a real measurable phenomenon. And then looking at the future sea level rise projections, this is where we're getting into the NOAA reports. The first one was 2017, most recent was 2022. And it's all based on different emission scenarios of what's happening on a global scale. So looking in the future, when Resilient Florida first started, we were really looking at the intermediate low and the intermediate high. I believe the recent change, I'd have to confirm this, but it's the intermediate and intermediate low. So it's becoming a little bit more conservative. But the fact of the matter is, it's impossible to predict exactly what's going to happen in 2060 or 2080. So everything has to be based on scenario planning. We have to look at multiple scenarios. We've often produced more than 60 maps for these projects, because every asset's going to require a different perspective. If you're building, a small public park versus a nuclear reactor, that's going to require a different perspective on what you're planning for. So it's all based on different planning scenarios and assumptions. These are some examples of vulnerability assessment exposure maps. So as you can see, we have all of the critical infrastructure assets mapped out. We have the flood rasters also showing the depth of flooding. Each community, it looks a little different, just depends on what we're looking at. But this is showing a wide array of different communities across Florida and how we've approached this, looking at each of the critical asset classes. Going back to Panama City, one of the most stark reminders from these vulnerability assessments is that it's not just sea level rise, it's not just planning for the future. This is a 100-year storm surge event, and very big parts of the downtown area are affected and this coastal area. So it just shows you what's at stake. And then looking at a worst case scenario or a very extreme 500-year event still under current conditions, you have the port of Panama City over here, you have a university, all of these residential assets, major roadways and evacuation routes, and you can see how much inundation is actually there. So the really important part of this process is to understand and highlight what the local topography is like, what's the geography, but also how assets were built and what changes need to be made with land use and infrastructure decisions. So just got a few more seconds and we'll close this out and go to questions with Matt and the team. But just want to reflect on some lessons learned. Working in Florida has been really rewarding recently because there's just so much momentum, and there's a lot of very talented people working together to collaborate and solve these issues. And the way we look at it is that it's essentially a whole of government or whole of community approach to planning. You don't often get opportunities where you can bring every decision maker to the table. You're looking at a community-wide issue. And you're looking at every single thing that touches that community. So it's been a really cool process to look at. I see some CFMs or certified floodplain managers in the audience. And, with FEMA's community rating system, there's opportunities to improve points and earn better scores through these types of planning processes. And, vulnerability assessments, like I said, with Panama City, it's created new opportunities. If we're looking at nature-based solutions, living shorelines, or just different types of structural solutions, it makes people think about what's possible. So it's been very interesting. The two photos on the bottom, the one on the bottom left, the person in the middle is Dr. Wesley Brooks. He's the Chief Resilience Officer for the state of Florida, reports to the governor. He's played a really important role in coordinating a statewide approach across our entire state. And this was with members of the Appalachia Regional Planning Council in half after we completed that 9-county vulnerability assessment. And then on the right, this is with the Tampa Bay Regional Council. They have the Tampa Bay Regional Resiliency Coalition. A lot of folks in here are actually elected officials. So there's some mayors, county commissioners. And it's just showing you that a lot of people are coming together. It's a very, nonpartisan issue. We don't want to see flooding in our communities. And I think that it's really opened up the doors for how we have to think about things. And just a few more pictures. I really didn't dive into anything outside of flooding today for a specific reason, because Resilient Florida has really been focused on water. But as part of the Resilient Pasco project that HAF and Fernleaf have been working on together, we did evaluate extreme heat. So there's been some communities that don't just want to take the water-based approach. They want to look at broader elements, including economic resilience, if we're looking at COVID-19 and the impacts that were caused there. Top right, that's also from the Resilient Pasco project, recently facilitated an intergovernmental workshop, had county reps, municipal reps, water management districts, state agencies. It was a really great opportunity. And I'm assuming that, some folks in the audience, just based on the geography, might be familiar with the University of Georgia and Athens has been doing. They have the Institute for Resilient Infrastructure Systems in Athens. So last year had a chance to attend an industry summit on nature-based solutions. So this was different than vulnerability assessments, but it's really where we're trying to go with the industry. So that was a really great engagement. Those are all private sector representatives working on coastal restoration, ecosystem restoration, living shorelines. So there's a lot of really cool work taking place all across the country. And this should be, yep, got 2 more slides. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this right now. I highlighted this, but there's a lot of strategies that you can consider after you complete a vulnerability assessment to actually promote flood mitigation and start going into design and implementation. So these are just a few examples. Maybe we can talk about this at another time, just for time's sake. And then really in closing, just want to highlight some public partners that I feel are really important to stay engaged with and reach out. I came from the public sector working for a regional council in Florida, and these were a lot of the entities that really played a major role in advancing the public side. FEMA has the Resilient Nation Partnership Network, great resource. If you are not familiar with the American Flood Coalition, get familiar with them. Nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. They have directors for individual states like North Carolina and Florida, have been really leading some amazing discussions with members of Congress and the Senate and mayors from across the country. And then there's all of these other great agencies and organizations, NOAA, FEMA, HUD, FDEP, Army Corps of Engineers has played a massive role. And then there's also the Engineering with Nature Initiative, which really was a product of the Army Corps of Engineers. University of Georgia has now been getting involved from a research lens. But there's a lot of amazing developments, and it's really taking place through collaboration and intentional alignment of what we're trying to focus on, not only as an industry and a network, but as a country. So final slide, and we'll close it out. Going back to Hurricane Michael, this is a photo of Mexico Beach in 2018, Category 5 impacts. And I've used this photo maybe more than 100 times to tell the same story, and a lot of other people have, but it speaks volumes that you can, as an individual, as a homeowner, or as a community, you can do everything in your power if you can afford it to, build resiliently. And if you have the resources, you can withstand essentially anything. But if you're not taking a community approach to these types of issues, if you're not looking at what's around you, you're going to miss the big picture. And Mexico Beach, years later, still rebuilding. It'll never be the same. This has a very big cultural impact on the psychology of communities. And I think that's something we really need to emphasize, that we need to focus on taking planning to action and actually fixing the issues. But I believe that's happening, and it's not only in Florida. There's a lot of great work taking place across your states. But my goal today was just to provide, a different perspective that you might have not been intimately familiar with. So with that said, we're going to go to an open discussion for the remainder of the time. Really appreciate everyone's participation. And you can contact me via email at slahav@half.com, and would really encourage everyone, if you have a chance, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear more from you. So with that said, if Matt and Hannah, you want to turn on your webcams, we can just close this out with questions and answers.
Great. Thank you both for your presentations. Those were fantastic. And we've got a few questions that have come into the Q&A chat. So if our attendees have additional questions, please feel free to add those into the Q&A. That's where we will be looking for your questions to come in. One of the first questions we received
Hannah,
was really focused.
I'm so
Go
sorry
ahead,
to interrupt
Jill.
you. It sounds a little bit robotic or fuzzy. I don't know if you have the capability to adjust that.
Let's see, does that sound a little better?
Much better.
Okay. Every time I switch between these different formats, it resets all my settings, so I apologize, but thanks for letting me know. Our first question came from Kayla, and it's really focused on land use policy and ordinances. And the question is focused on where should communities start if you're really just beginning this conversation in your community. Where would you begin as far as your land use ordinance or those land use policies that each of our communities are responsible for carrying out?
Matt, I think this is probably a good one based on what Fernleaf has interacted with recently.
Okay, yeah, I can take a first stab and then feel free to chime in, Sean. That's a great question. I think the first point that comes to mind is that applicable ordinances are going to be different for each type of hazard and each type of risk that a community is concerned about. For example, the floodplain development ordinance for flooding, obviously, but building code ordinance for high wind events. That's one in Florida that we've been working with communities on. Different types of zoning and land use ordinances as it pertains to a wildfire risk. And so I think that's the first point that comes to mind, is thinking about how ordinances are really tailored for different types of protections and different types of issues. And so looking at those specifically, and that's where it really needs to also look at the local conditions. There are modifications in local statutes that will add on to international building code elements that are really important to consider. Another thing that comes to mind is I think what we're finding in a lot of communities is the type of vulnerabilities and risks that are present is in some cases the large amount of vulnerability is based on infrastructure that was developed pre-ordinance. I think the floodplain development ordinances through most, at least maybe mid-Atlantic and southeastern states, those weren't developed until the 1970s, at least. In some communities, a little bit later than that. And so when you're looking at the profile for risk, a lot of it is heavily tilted towards these pre-development ordinance assets. And so thinking about then incentives that can be applied to help bring those into compliance or other types of support. And obviously that's a really tricky topic when you're talking about especially ingrained community members and folks that have been in communities for decades, and how they are largely at most risk due to when development ordinances came into place. So it's a really tricky complex kind of topic there. The last thing I'll mention, or one other thing, is thinking about not only regulatory standards, but where there's supplemental information. And that's where the assessment process is really providing a lot of value for planners, we're finding, in that we're not just talking about the regulatory floodplain anymore, but using supplemental information, which may not have regulatory policy, but can help for planning purposes be supplemental. And so when we're talking about future conditions, hazards that may not be regulatory in terms of extents of different types of flooding. But thinking about and where we see the kind of leading edge of new development ordinances or land use ordinances is thinking outside the box, using supplemental information while still compliant, obviously, with regulations and standards, but be able to consider more than the regulatory. And there's a few examples of looking at the 500-year rather than the 100-year flood event, for example, or looking at future conditions and not only current conditions. So there's a couple examples that came to mind. Sean, is there anything else that you want to add to that?
No, I think you covered it really well. I was just going to say that there's a lot of resources out there where there's essentially like encyclopedias on this type of stuff. There's the Georgetown University Adaptation Clearinghouse. And so if you go on their website, they have a search bar function. I think you can look across different states. And that's been a trusted resource for years now for a lot of folks. And I think Matt made a really strong point with when regulations were enacted. So I'm talking a lot about Pasco County too, in addition to Panama City. That's what Matt and I are working on right now. And as part of the vulnerability assessment for Pasco County, Florida, which is on the Gulf of Mexico, Fernleaf actually took those regulation components into the analysis steps and documented. So if we have 1,000 buildings or even residential homes, let's just use a hypothetical, what percentage of those were built before 1979? What percentage of those were built after 1979 when there was different base flood elevation thresholds? So that's a really interesting part of telling the story, because a lot of communities, if they're brand new, they're going to withstand this in different ways. If we're looking at wind resistance, the building materials, new homes are built differently. But what do you do with retrofitting older homes? It's always a big question. And then just to keep this moving along, because there's some other really interesting questions, and I think Matt and I can both complement this next one. Looking at the fiscal value, so how can a community determine the fiscal value of a resilience action and project, specifically when it comes to selling the project to governing bodies? And so that's been a key part of what Fernleaf has been able to, provide to us as part of these like assessments that we've worked on together. And again, going back to Pasco County, when we inventoried all of the assets in this like tracking spreadsheet, Fernleaf and Matt's team pulled the replacement costs, property values, all of these kind of fiscal components to tell the bigger picture. And we were able to, achieve a few things there, in that from a macro perspective, we could say for transportation assets, there's more than $100 million at risk under this scenario. It starts showing the fiscal components and how that speaks to elected officials. I'm not sure if we're the judge of that yet. It just depends on the community and what their priorities are. But people do care about numbers, and especially in today and how competitive certain grant programs are and things like that. You have to show return on investment. You have to show efficiency, that this is actually going to work. Is this a tested idea? Things like that. So there's a lot of things like that. And the final thing, there have been efforts to quantify resilience. My perspective on that is it can sometimes be a little bit abstract for folks to fully grasp. But there's been studies on mangroves, of the economic benefits that mangroves produce for communities all across Florida, nature-based solutions, forests, the impacts of seawalls, all sorts of things. So I think the economic theory, which is outside of my expertise, is going to become a really big part of how this is looked at. And Matt, if you want to add or complement to that.
Yeah, no, that was great. I think you answered a lot. A couple things that came to mind as well to add on as a couple things. One is in terms of thinking about benefits, and especially even for fiscal benefits, taking a multi-hazard approach to that, we've seen a lot of value in that. And so what we mean by that is not just be able to say this has a flood risk benefit and maybe a fiscal benefit from that, but if you can combine that with a high wind event, in some cases, there's some communities that have earthquake risk, looking at different types of hazards, the multi-benefit as you add more hazards to the consideration of projects, you add this multi-hazard benefit to that fiscal approach. Another thing that we found really key is thinking about not only physical benefits, but also essential service benefits. And there's a couple examples. One, a community that had a project that would protect a daycare, for example. On a dollar value, the daycare was not a high value property, but when you attach the service of 90 children 5 days a week that are accessing daycare, or that families are, that had a huge fiscal benefit to protecting and including that in the project area. And so thinking a little bit beyond the direct kind of impact or even things that you get from a direct damage assessment, but thinking about essential services. The other thing that came to mind there, and there was a component there of, was it communicating benefits? What we found really critical in most communities is engaging emergency managers. And the emergency management lens to livelihoods, to safety, and lifelines kind of approach to thinking about, which emergency managers do day in, day out. Be able to frame and message the benefits from that angle has been really critical for communicating and building support. So again, that's kind of attached to that fiscal benefit side. The last thing is, traditionally, a lot of projects have required a cost benefit analysis, especially for federal funds, like FEMA BRIC projects require a cost benefit analysis, but that is it's still true for large projects, but there's some changes to that recently. It was just this year that FEMA provide new guidance on I believe they call it a streamlined benefit cost analysis, which basically doesn't require a engineering level cost benefit to be provided with projects under $1 million. And that's been pretty game changing in terms of what can be proposed and what especially small, low capacity communities can put forward. And just the information you saw in our presentations would be adequate for what they require is a cost effectiveness narrative. So that's been another, I think there's changes in the cost benefit analysis space, and there's known limitations of cost benefit analyses as well that are worth mentioning. But sorry to add on to a few things, but there's a couple more that were coming to mind there. But that was a great question.
You're not coming through, Hannah. I can't hear you at all. No.
Let's try this one. Is that better?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, great. Building on that, what are some of the funding sources that you have come across that are outside of the traditional locally funded CIP or project funds that communities of all sizes could be taking advantage of?
Yeah, and we can kill two birds with one stone on this one. So just to quickly answer the other question that was presented, we'll get to the funding component because we can spend a few minutes on this. Julia asked, does Florida DP maintain a clearinghouse of completed vulnerability assessments? And the answer is yes. The question that I don't have a concrete answer on is the extent of how publicly available that is. So a lot of the communities that we've worked with have been very adamant, like, we don't want this circulating everywhere because it has sensitive water treatment plants. Like, there's national security considerations with how they have to ensure compliance. But every single vulnerability assessment in Florida, with the exception of 2, have all been funded by the state of Florida there was guidelines that we all had to follow. There was a compliance checklist, and DEP is the final say on whether this is compliant or not. And if it's not, they're not going to reimburse you on the grant. So this is a very state-driven process, and through that, municipalities have benefited because they have their own products, but the state has all of this compiled somewhere where they can pull any community at any second and know what's going on. And then the two other things, the state of Florida contacted every consultant team and every local government who did a VA and uploaded the critical asset data. So there's a data set of all critical assets in the state of Florida, all in one place. And then our colleagues over at Taylor Engineering and Jones Edmonds, both Florida-based companies, have been working with DEP on a statewide vulnerability assessment for all 67 counties. It's not stitching what everyone did separately together. It's making some new products that have some statewide implications in terms of flood modeling. So just wanted to point that out. And Matt and I will share this last one, and I think we got one more after that. But in terms of the funding component, what I can say is that 90% of the time, these projects are not going to be able to be supported by local funds. It's just there's not enough revenue to support those types of expenditures. Communities are strapped for cash in many regards. It depends. If you're the city of Jacksonville, city of Tampa, or Miami, you're in a different kind of posture with capital improvements. You have different kind of funding streams you can leverage. So that brings into question two critical components. There's the state funding that Resilient Florida has made available. It's highly competitive, though. I think the past few years there's been like $2.5 to $3 billion in requests, and they can only fund like 100 to 500 million. So there's a huge demand, but not enough money to go around. And there's a geographical equity consideration. Is all of the money being funneled into Miami? Rightfully so, because of the issues they're facing. But what about other communities suffering in other parts of the state? So that's a big part of it. And then with the federal side, it's looking at FEMA's BRIC program. It's looking at all sorts of things offered by NOAA, coastal restoration grants. There's National Fish and Wildlife Foundation grants. And I think that what Matt would agree with me on is that you have to really be creative on the funding side, that you have to tie benefits and co-benefits together. A great example in the city of Jacksonville, Florida, where I live, Jacksonville just received its largest grant in its entire history, $150 million to support the Emerald Trail, which is a transformative urban design program that will expand trails, alleviate flooding, but it's producing economic community benefits, but also addressing those resilience components. And I think that's where the federal government's going to start moving, and state governments. It has to tackle different things. It can't just be, it can be flood mitigation, but if you're tacking on other components, equity, those types of things, it's going to make you a lot more competitive. And Matt, if you have anything to add to that too.
No, that was great. Great, Sean. I think you covered that one really well.
And it looks like just one more question.
Yeah, there were a couple, one more question after this, and it's really about tax credits, particularly around floodplain structure changes or removals.
To be honest, I'm not really sure on the tax credit side in Florida. With flood proofing and with property elevation, there are a few different things. I believe that FEMA has grants, but they're not massive, up to like $20,000 or $25,000 to support property elevation. So that's one opportunity. And we just did some case study research, I believe, in Miami. The local government created a similar thing that they'll give you, or a private homeowner, $20,000 to $25,000 for flood proofing. But I don't know if I've seen any tax incentives or rebates or anything like that. And not sure about North Carolina.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with like individual or homeowner tax credits. The thing that comes to mind is for local governments is community rating system credits for flood proofing and for buyouts and that sort
Oh,
of
that's
thing.
great point. Great point.
But that was kind of, I'm not familiar with like homeowner tax credits very much in North Carolina.
Yeah, and what Matt's point just brought up is that if a community is more dedicated to advancing resilience through FEMA's community rating system, I think this is a great closing kind of thought process. You get flood insurance discounts for your residents. So it's kind of reverse, but the lower your score, let's say your score is a 2, you're going to have massive discounts for your residents and they're going to like you. So it's there's some trade-offs, but I would highly encourage anyone involved in floodplain management, research those communities that are at the lowest scores, which is the best scores, and figure out what have they done differently compared to your community and just model that. There's a lot of great resources, and that does produce immediate benefits for residents. So
We had one more question come in that we didn't touch a lot on, but maybe both of you could sort of weigh in on, and it's around extreme heat and how we incorporate that into resilience planning in communities.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and yeah, definitely, I think making space for other types of hazards is really key. And when we talk about resilience planning approaches, because it's often, I think, under represented. For extreme heat, there's some resources that have been coming out recently. The U.S. Census has community resilience estimates, and they actually have a new heat metric that has been really well done and includes wet bulb temperatures. And so it's definitely something for folks to be aware of. It's nationwide as well, and includes a lot of information regarding homeowners that have air conditioning versus not, tree canopy coverage, and again, temperature information. I think thinking about a multi hazard strategy is also really key when it comes to extreme heat. Extreme heat is the number one hazard that results in deaths across the country. And so it's a really under represented in some cases in resilience planning, considering the huge consequence that extreme heat has. Part of the issue is, especially in humid areas, that there's less nighttime cooling occurring in communities than before. And it's one of the biggest climate change variables that we're seeing across, especially southeastern states. And so there's less relief at nighttime in summertime events. And so it's really a health, looking at it through a health lens is really key. And then thinking about strategies for cooling, and that's really a community-wide planning element, thinking about where is equitable access to cooling centers, how can that be provided, and thinking about from an infrastructure element, if there's retrofitting for flooding, can there be retrofits that are provided for extreme heat mitigation as well? So there's a lot of areas that we could dig into. But Sean, I'll pause and see if there's anything else you want to mention.
no, I think you've covered it, and I never imagined that I'd be working on extreme heat analyses. It just kind of happened, but it's because it's becoming an item of interest, and I think every state, every community is going to focus on what priority to them, and the way we've always looked at it is that resilience is going to apply to every single location in the world, but it's going to look different in every location in the world. And in the Midwest, you have tornadoes. Out west, you have drought. You have wildfires. In the Southeast, you have hurricanes. You have winter storms in Colorado, mudslides. So it all depends on what community you're working with. And I think the main lesson that I would like folks to take away from this is that think about what resilience means to you, what it means to your profession, what it means to your community, and use it as a framework or a lens to evaluate or investigate something. It doesn't have to be climate change, even it doesn't have to be water related. It can really be anything. And resilience is a little different than sustainability in some ways, where I really think resilience is like almost like how are you measuring performance over time? And it's a really solid way of understanding how a system operates and the nuances that the system deals with. But yeah, great points, Matt. And we went full 90 minutes.
We did. Thank you both for your time today and for sharing your expertise. Jillian, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Well, thank you so much, Sean, Matt, and Hannah. Incredible presentations, and I'm so glad that we were also able to have a robust conversation and discussion with attendees. Thank you very much, attendees. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar was recorded, and you will receive an email in your inboxes in just a few days with the link to the recording and the slide decks, excuse me, as well. But otherwise, I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon. And again, thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.